Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into a really big question. Where could the next financial storm be brewing? Well, a new paper from the Bank of England suggests the answer might be hiding in plain sight, inside the corporate bond market.
The paper we're looking at is a brand new working paper. It's called Bond Financing Conditions, Economic Activity, and the Financial Accelerator. And it's by Eduardo Mecchi, Marcia Silva Pereira, and Nicholas Vaus. They're tackling a really important question here.
So let's look at the abstract. It basically lays out three key discoveries. First, it shows how stress in the UK bond market can kind of ripple out and affect the entire economy. Second, it gives us a new tool to spot that stress, something they call the excess bond premium, or EBP, and they argue it's way more powerful than the old signals. And finally, it shows that this stress doesn't hit everyone the same way, and that gets us to this idea of a financial accelerator.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with why this market is such a big deal now. Then we'll crack the code on that key concept, the EBP. We'll take a peek inside the researcher's toolkit, see the huge economic ripples a bond market shock can create, find out who gets hit the hardest, and then we'll wrap it all up with the final lessons.
Okay, first up, a bond market mystery. Why are we so hyper-focused on corporate bonds all of a sudden?
Well, the reason is pretty simple. It's about the money. Back in the early 1990s, UK companies raised about, say, 15% of their money by issuing bonds. But you fast forward to today, and that number has just skyrocketed to over 40%. We're talking about companies raising almost as much cash from bonds as they do from old-school bank loans. This isn't some niche market anymore. It's right at the center of the action.
And that huge scale creates a whole new problem. I mean, with this much money sloshing around, how do you tell the difference between just normal, everyday business risk, a company's sales are down a bit, and something much deeper, something more dangerous brewing in the financial system itself? How do you find that real danger signal in all of the noise?
And that question brings us right to Section 2, cracking the code with the EBP. This is the special tool the researchers built to find that hidden fever in the market.
So what on earth is this excess bond premium? Okay, think of it this way. It's the part of the extra cost a company pays on its bonds, what they call the spread, that you can't explain with the obvious stuff, like how likely the company is to default. It's like the unexplained part of a fever. It doesn't measure how sick the company is, it measures how nervous investors are. When the EBP is high, it means investors are getting scared and they're pulling back on lending.
And this shows us exactly how they do it. They look at a bond's total spread, and they split it into two buckets. The first is the fitted spread. That's the predictable part, based on all the known risks of the company. Everything else, the mysterious part that's left over, well, that's the excess bond premium. And that's the part that tells you something bigger is going on.
And this chart illustrates the key point perfectly. Look, the fitted spread is the bigger slice of the pie, sure, but it's pretty stable. The EBP, that's the smaller slice, but man, is it volatile. The paper shows that it's this smaller, jumpier piece that's actually driving all the major, sudden moves in the market. The exact kind of moves that scream trouble ahead.
Okay, so how did the researchers actually measure all this? Let's go to Section 3 and take a quick peek inside their toolkit.
Now, they didn't just guess. They started with a huge data set, grabbing bond prices from the ICE platform and tons of financial data for each company. First, to figure out a company's basic risk, they used what's called the Merton model to calculate a distance to default, which is basically a score for how close a firm is to going bankrupt. Then they used a standard statistical tool, an OLS regression, to figure out how much of a bond's cost could be explained by that risk score. Whatever was left over, that became their measure of the EBP. So now we have our very finely tuned alarm bell. Let's see what actually happens when it goes off. On to Section 4. Ripples across the economy.
So the researchers ran a simulation. They asked, what happens to the UK economy if there's a sudden shock to the EBP? We're talking a one standard deviation jump, about 53 basis points, which signals that credit conditions just got a whole lot tighter real fast. So what's the fallout? Well, the first domino to fall is investment. The paper finds that after about a year and a half, national investment hits rock bottom, dropping by a really significant 3.8%. Companies just stop spending money on new buildings, new machines, new tech.
And when investment freezes up, the entire economy catches a cold. Right around that same time, GDP, the biggest measure of our economic health, hits its lowest point, falling by 2%. A small-sounding tremor in the bond market sends a massive shockwave across the whole economy.
But the story gets even crazier, because that damage is not spread out evenly, not even close. Which brings us to Section 5. Who gets hit the hardest? This is where we really see that financial accelerator kick in.
The researchers sorted all these companies into two basic groups. On one side, you've got the financially resilient firms, low debt, not too dependent on bonds. And on the other side, you have the financially vulnerable ones, lots of debt and really, really dependent on the bond market for cash.
Okay, now watch this. When that EBP shock hits, what happens? For the resilient firms? Not much. Their investment doesn't really budge in a way that's statistically significant. But for the vulnerable firms? Whoa. Their investment in things like new equipment just plummets by a staggering 9%. They are forced to slam on the spending brakes way harder than anybody else.
And that right there, that is the perfect definition of the financial accelerator. A credit shock doesn't just tap the brakes on the economy. It hits the most vulnerable companies so hard that they end up amplifying the original shock, turning what started as a small problem into a much, much bigger one for all of us.
Which brings us to our final section, the EBP's final lessons. What should we really be taking away from all of this research?
It really boils down to two huge lessons. First, the EBP isn't just some academic number. It's a real-deal canary in the coal mine. It's a powerful early warning signal for the economy. And second, it shows just how valuable financial diversity is. Relying too much on one single source of cash, like the bond market, creates some really dangerous weak spots for companies and for the economy as a whole.
So at the end of the day, this research makes it crystal clear. Deep inside the super complex world of corporate bonds, there are signals being sent about the health of our economy. They tell us not just if a storm might be coming, but exactly who's standing in the rain without an umbrella when it hits. The bond market is talking. The only real question left is, are we listening?